So what I'm here to do is talk to you today about engaging healers in the fight against domestic violence. What we find is that the majority of domestic violence victims aren't actually ever going to see an advocate. They don't know how to get to us, they don't know that we exist, or they don't know what we do or what provisions we offer, what resources we have. And so that makes them a little bit nervous about coming to see an advocate, if they even know that we exist. And that means that there are a number of folks who are, in essence, on the front lines. You are the people that domestic violence victims are going to see on a regular basis. You are the folks that they're going to build trust with. And if you're capable of understanding domestic violence, screening effectively for domestic violence, and providing information to domestic violence victims, you're going to not just increase your own healthcare intervention efficacy, but you're also going to get those folks to the resources that can help them in their situation for the long term. And so there's a lot of good that comes from this working together. And so on that, I had, and this is actually a pretty standard situation, but I had recently responded to a call for on-scene response. So my organization works directly with our local police department, and we respond to domestic violence calls on scene. And the idea is that since most folks don't actually ever get to us, we'll meet them there. And I met this young woman who had been a victim of family violence in her home state, and then later a victim of domestic violence, teen dating violence, and then domestic violence as she married her teen partner who was abusive to her. And then she left, she moved here, and had a relationship with a partner who was violent here, moved to another state, moved back here. And in all of that, she had experienced reproductive coercion, rape. She'd have her jaw broken, her leg broken. She'd been strangled several times, a number of injuries. And when I sat down and talked to her, she thought that domestic violence advocates didn't exist in other states. I was the first one she ever met, despite having gone to the hospital a number of times for very severe domestic violence related injuries. And at no point in time had anyone ever talked to her about what was happening to her or had resourced her to an advocate. And so for her, this was actually really revolutionary. Someone finally talked to her about her situation. And so that's what we're hoping is going to happen less. I want to hear more stories about someone who came to us because their medical practitioner resourced them here. And so a little bit of information on domestic violence in general. Domestic violence is extraordinarily pervasive. 1 in 4 women are going to experience domestic violence in their lifetime. You'll notice that some of the language I'll talk about is gendered, and the reason it's gendered is that women do predominantly experience domestic violence based upon just a number of sort of social reasons that we see. The issues of power and control, women typically tend to be victims in that situation. So 85% of domestic violence victims are women. And then we do see, however, and it's important to note, men can be victims of domestic violence, and couples in same-sex relationships will experience domestic violence at the same rate as heterosexual couples. Domestic violence is a leading cause of injury to women in the US, and it is a leading cause of death to pregnant women. Contrary to what you may think would be rational, domestic violence increases often when folks are pregnant. The cost of domestic violence exceeds $5.8 billion each year, and it costs an extraordinary amount in days lost for work. Workplaces actually pay a lot of money when they have their employees as victims of domestic violence who are not getting help, not getting aid. And that's something for you to also take in as medical practitioners. At some point in time, you may work in your own practice, your own clinic. You may have your own employees. And so beyond simply treating your patients, also treating your workforce. And then the medical impact of domestic violence. 81% of domestic violence victims suffer from a chronic health condition. So this is a huge percentage of folks. And they are more likely to suffer from chronic health conditions listed here. And there's quite a few, from asthma to irritable bowel syndrome, chronic pain, gastrointestinal disorders, to migraines and headaches. And I will say that I have been screened twice for domestic violence in my history of going to doctors. Once was actually really recently with my new doctor, who I like a lot. And the other was previously I was at a doctor's appointment, and I happened to be at this appointment with my husband. And I was screened with him sitting next to me, which was an extraordinarily ineffective screening. And fortunately, I'm with a very safe partner, because that could have actually been very dangerous for me, and we'll cover that. And I mention this because I have migraines. And so I've seen a number of physicians about migraines. Migraines definitely put me in a category of folks who are likely to have experienced domestic violence, and I've never been screened by anyone who's ever treated my migraines, except for my current doctor, to get back. Domestic violence victims are also more likely to have reproductive issues, anything from gynecological disorders to STDs, preterm delivery, low birth weight babies. Again, they're also more likely to suffer from social and psychological issues, anxiety, depression. PTSD is, of course, going to be a huge factor for domestic violence victims. If you think that soldiers are more likely to experience PTSD than the regular population, that due to the nature of what they're doing, they're in a situation that's heightened all the time. They don't know what's going to come at them next. They don't know when the next violent occurrence is going to happen. And based upon this heightened level of stress over time and the unpredictability of the situation, their likelihood for experiencing PTSD rises. And of course, that also mirrors exactly what a domestic violence victim also suffers. And so PTSD is extraordinarily high among DV victims, and also create some difficulties in providing care for domestic violence victims as well. So what is domestic violence? Domestic violence is a pattern of assaultive and coercive behaviors that are used to gain and maintain power and control. And that's really, really important. Domestic violence isn't just a couple had an argument at one point in time and someone pushed someone, which shouldn't happen. I'm not obviously condoning that, but this is a long patterned behavior. And typically, if someone pushes someone, there's been some other things happening previous to that push, and that it's all of these behaviors that are part of a domestic violence pattern. And so, to think about this, I know a gentleman who he grew up in a very violent household. Not all abusers do, but he did. He swore he would never be like his father, and then was violently abusive to his first two wives. And this was in the late 70s, early 80s. And he nearly lost custody of his son due to his level of violence, and was very, very fortunately for him paired with an extraordinary outreach program for battering men in Marin County, California. And over many years began to heal and to change, and now is a counselor for men who batter. And what he says about his violence at that point in time was, he gets really upset when someone sends someone who's violent to anger management classes, because he says, I managed my anger really, really well. I wasn't randomly explosive. I knew exactly who I was targeting and how I was targeting. It wasn't a moment where I just lost my temper. It was a desire to take control. And so I oftentimes think of domestic violence perpetrators very much like a parasite. They don't have a lot of internal power, and their goal is to take power from this person that they've attached themselves to. That parasitic analogy, I think, might also help us better understand, one, the impact of being a victim of domestic violence. anyone who has a parasite is going to be weakened in a number of ways. And that's part of the role of a domestic violence abuser, is this parasitic relationship where they are weakening. They are gaining strength by removing strength. The other piece of it, too, is to remember, and we'll continue to discuss this as we go on, that it's very dangerous to leave a domestic violence relationships. Parasites don't like to leave their host, and they tend to fight really hard to keep them. And that, again, can be used, I think, in a domestic violence discussion. And so this is our power and control wheel. Domestic violence has a lot of wheels. Thought about making a train full of the wheels we come up with to explain domestic violence, but this is our power and control wheel. It's our most basic explanation. And so, of course, power and control is in the middle. Physical and sexual violence are on the outside of this wheel because they can be part of any one of those pie pieces, but they do not need to be part of a relationship to be violent. So it can be part of it. They can fit into any of those pie pieces, but they don't have to either. And the idea is that you can control somebody by using a wide variety of tactics. And those perpetrators who are not physically or sexually violent and those who are also tend to use many of these too. And so, for example, using intimidation. I knew there was a judge was telling me the story of a woman who, on her honeymoon, her husband had hit her and hit her only once. They got into an argument on their honeymoon, and he punched her in the face and broke her nose. And then 2 years later, she was trying to leave him. And people were wondering, okay, well, he punched her once. What happened in this time? And she said what he would do was, how it happened was they were in an argument. He pounded his fist on the table, and then he punched her in the nose. And after that, every time that she would disagree with him about anything, he would just go like this, as a reminder to her of where she was supposed to behave and where her place was. And so in that, he was able to utilize that maneuver right there as a mechanism of control. And in fact, fortunately, this judge was really pretty awesome. And when she recanted her testimony on the stand, he didn't berate her, but took her aside and said, hey, something happened here? And she said, yeah, he was talking to me. And when I was giving my testimony, he was sitting at the table and he went like this. And she froze. And of course, no one in the courtroom knew what was going on. He just put his fist down. And so, using isolation, domestic violence victims are oftentimes isolated from friends and family. And that also means that they don't spend a lot of time alone without their abuser. And that does make oftentimes screening for domestic violence hard. Using children, and that can be using children to say, I'm going to call CPS, or I'm going to have the children take the children away, or I'm going to be the threat for the children. There are a number of people who stay behind because if their partner is going to have shared custody, they'd rather be the person in between their partner and the kids. And pets is a really big one, actually. And if you aren't a pet owner, you might be like, pets? But if you are, you're like, what? Because oftentimes you leave your home and that person may torture or kill your animal. And if I have a couple dogs, I have a couple cats. If I thought that was going to happen, I would really reconsider. No joke. And then a huge one is economic abuse. Over half the women who are homeless or are on welfare are also victims of domestic violence. Typically, domestic violence perpetrators control the money. And so when a person leaves, that they're leaving with a backpack. And so when we oftentimes tell people, oh, you should leave, think about what that means, especially if you've got kids, to walk out with a backpack. That's an extraordinary decision. And also to face the world unknown. Domestic violence is terrifying, but sometimes the devil you know is better than the devil you don't. So, a few expanded definitions of domestic violence. Intimate partner violence, we've just covered. Teen dating violence, of course, is very similar. Oftentimes we'll incorporate more utilization of Facebook and sort of like peer pressure within those forms of social media. It's also important to recognize that teens experience violence 1 in 5. And so that most people who experience adult domestic violence began experiencing teen dating violence. And part of that is that teens have power issues. If anybody's has teens. Teens have power issues. And so as they're trying to figure that out, they tend to be very concerned about being embarrassed or saving face in front of their peers. And so controlling their partner so their partner doesn't cheat is a good gateway for teen dating violence to occur. And teens are just bad at dating. They're new. They don't really, so there's some factors they're figuring out. And so they actually are a really high risk category and one we often ignore because we think it's just teen drama. And then finally, reproductive coercion. And I mention this specifically to you all who may be working with women who are pregnant. But oftentimes in violent relationships, choosing when you have sex, choosing what you do when you have sex, choosing whether or not you're going to get pregnant is not part of that relationship. Those choices aren't made available to a victim. And oftentimes, there can be situations where an abuser forces a pregnant woman to abort. But there are also many, many situations where birth control is sabotaged because it's harder to leave your partner when you have children with them. So why do they stay? And I have that in quotes because it is the most often asked question for anyone who works in domestic violence. I sort of joke that I have a really bad barbecue job because I might be sitting there, you're sitting there talking to strangers, you've got your beer, and you're like, hey, what do you do? And Bob's like, I'm insurance. And then they ask me, and I'm like, I work in domestic violence. And I'm probably going to get that question followed up by, if someone did that to me, it would kill them. Which I was like, oh, it's a lot of murderers I know. So, one, most do leave. They leave 7 to 8 times before they leave for good. And that's really important. That can be really frustrating for a lot of folks. Why do they keep going back? Well, one, I always think of it, if someone has left, come to get our services and gone back to their partner, maybe we're ticking off a time. Every time they leave, they get stronger. Every time they leave and they start to feel things out on their own 2 feet, you get stronger. You're building up. A lot of reasons people go back are housing insecurity. They go back because they don't have any financial resources, and so we'll cover a lot of these, why they stay. One is fear. So in Arizona in 2013, there were 121 domestic violence fatalities in our state. We see that the risk for being killed in a domestic violence relationship skyrockets when you're leaving or have left. 75% of domestic violence fatalities occur during that time. And so this is a really volatile time. Just leaving actually isn't a safe plan. Leaving takes a lot of thought and a lot of consideration. If a perpetrator threatens to keep or kill the children, you're probably going to get someone to stay. A lot of victims
make you look crazy so that you don't get your kids in the divorce.
That's actually a really big one. That's a great example. Also, I just want to throw out, I'm really glad that you shouted that out, and if anyone else has things to shout out, please do. Yeah, making someone look like they're crazy is part of that power and control wheel. And if you've experienced violence, you're working through a lot. And it's interesting because lots of times people who are perpetrators of violence are really cool when they need to be cool. And so what happens is, let's say that the police are called and they go to the house. The victim is freaking out because they were just perpetrated against, and it was horrific. And the abuser is all cool. Hey, officers, I don't know, she's got a lot of mental health issues. We've been trying to work through this. I love her, but sometimes I can't. And the officers are going, oh, yeah, I understand. I understand she's got some problems, and maybe he's got some defensive wounds on him, and oh, well, we can't with the he said, she said. And not looking at the larger picture of violence, and that in itself is a power and control tactic, and often what times one used to keep children. A lot of victims may not understand or mistrust the criminal justice system. And that example I just gave is a really good reason why. Lots of times people are dually charged. So for example, in the very big public case out there right now, Ray Rice was of course given his misdemeanor domestic violence charge. But Janae Rice was also charged that day that he punched her. She was charged for disturbing the peace. Because prior to the elevator incident, before he punched her in the elevator, they had argued loudly outside the elevator. And so when the police showed up after he had knocked her out, they gave them both tickets. So when people say, oh, I don't understand why she doesn't just leave, that's not a person who's had a lot of support. And so, and that piece isn't talked about often. That person may also have no other means of financial support. It's a big move to leave with the backpack. I mean, if I show up to someone's house and I'm like, okay, let's go. You can take 2 bags. What do you take? Think about that. Think about that for your kids. What do you take in 2 bags? And of course, I'm telling you, a lot of these things we can help you replace your clothes and all of those things, but those are your things. I'm trying to help this person put stuff in their bag, but I'm also going, I don't want to leave my clothes. I like my clothes. But I also, of course, have my memorabilia that I have to take. They may have reconciled. Domestic violence perpetrators are not always violent. They are sometimes really sweet. They are sometimes really loving. They may hit you, and then they may provide you with roses. And how many of you have ever had a friendship, just a friendship, where, God, you remember the good times with this friend, and then things change and you didn't know why, and you stayed with this toxic relationship for a really long time because you thought, I remember how cool they used to be. They're going to get there again. I just got to support them through this period. And they continue to drain you. We've all, have you? Raise your hand. Put it up there if you've had that friendship. I think we've all had that friendship, right? And now heighten it to your romantic partner. We believe in people who we once cared deeply about. And then finally, guilt. You're the reason I was arrested. If you leave me, I will kill myself. There's a lot of reasons that someone who is emotionally invested in their partner may stay. And all of those feed into how we understand domestic violence and how we treat domestic violence. Now, of course, domestic violence and trauma. Domestic violence victims are also going to have experienced a deep level of trauma. It is traumatic to have the person that you care for, one of the most deeply, or one of those most deeply, harm you. And so they're going to have some emotional symptoms of shock and disbelief, irritability, maybe some guilt, some self-blame, some confusion, difficulty concentrating, withdrawing from others, feeling numb or disconnected. Physical symptoms may include nightmares, easily startled, aches and pains, fatigued, agitation. Which means that domestic violence victims are also not super easy to work with. Someone comes into shelter and you say, hey, could you put your backpack in the corner? And they go, oh yeah, I'm on that. And then the next thing you know, they're not. And you're like, hey, could you put your backpack in the corner? Oh yeah, I'm on that. And then they're not. And you think, what is going on here? This person doesn't respect what I'm saying. They're not listening to me. This person's got a lot more going on than the backpack in the corner. And so their experience of trauma is making it very hard for them to be able to follow and remember simple instructions. And it has nothing to do with intellect. It has nothing to do with their actual skill and ability. It has to do with experiencing trauma in this moment and what they can and can't do. Which means something for you as healers. If you provide someone with a healthcare intervention that you think is very important, and is very important, and you see that they're just not following your advice, and you think, this person doesn't care about themselves or their bodies. They don't care if they're hurt or injured. And really what's happening is, if they're not safe at home, that's their priority. What you're offering may be really important, but it's going to come second. And so first, to make sure that someone is going to actually use your interventions wisely and well, they have to be able to concentrate on that. They have to be able to prioritize it, which means that home safety has to be something that they are experiencing. And it also means that domestic violence victims don't act like we see them on TV. which is a really big factor. You wouldn't think that that is, but it is. We tend to see two different kinds of domestic violence victims. You tend to get the heroine who is beautiful and tragic, and she is always calm and demure. She never has wild mood swings or gets really upset or is irritable or anxious. And she runs away the first time and gets away from him, and then she meets a really nice guy. She has absolutely no problems finding herself in a new relationship that is healthy and normal. And having experienced all of this trauma has not seemed to create any problems with her for now. And then of course she'll be stalked by this guy. And when she is stalked by this guy, she'll pull out a gun and be like, I'm going to defend myself. And then she will defend herself successfully, and she will not go to prison. And that is really amazing, and not how it works in real life. Domestic violence victims are experiencing a lot. And so they're not going to be this really neat little package of like, I'm going to help you, and you're going to be really excited that I have intervened on your behalf, that this person took power and control from you, and now I'm going to too, and I'm going to make decisions for you, and you're going to just listen to me. No one wants that. We seem to think it's okay in movies when someone comes in and rescues, but that's not what someone's looking for. And so oftentimes, because of this, domestic violence victims are stigmatized. And what we hear and see about domestic violence and sexual violence shapes how we think about domestic and sexual violence. How we think about it shapes how we treat victims, and how we treat victims shapes what their experiences are and how they think about themselves ultimately. To be a domestic violence victim is also to be the victim of a stigma. We continually wonder why she doesn't leave, why she stays, did she provoke it, what was she doing, what was she thinking. Rarely do we ask, why did that person punch her? That really is not a very often asked question. We typically focus on the victim and wonder why this victim is being victimized. And so being the victim of a stigma means that oftentimes the blame for the situation is going to rest on the stigmatized party. That the stigmatized party's behaviors and actions are the ones we're going to focus on. Maybe you wouldn't get hit if you didn't act so erratically. Not, maybe I wouldn't act so erratically if I didn't get hit. Stigmatized persons often experience withdrawal of communal support, including family and friends, which are those natural resources that make it easier to leave. When those are gone, it's a lot harder. And oftentimes resources available to those who have been stigmatized will rest on the requirement that the stigmatized party, change their behavior. So now think about what that means. You're experiencing violence, you have PTSD, you are really wrapping your mind around trying to deal with all these things. And the only way services are offered to you now is if you can get a handle on your trauma symptoms. And so, not our shelter, but some shelters, for example, will have a policy that there are so many chores you're supposed to do when you're in shelter to be a collective member of the shelter society. And so let's say that you don't do your chores. A lot of times shelters may decide that you can't stay there anymore, and they'll ask you to leave, they'll exit you. Which is interesting, because that sounds a lot like a domestic violence relationship. If you don't do your chores, I'm going to make you homeless. And so lots of times we will, for someone who's having a hard time coping and may just need to stay in their room for a couple days and just be like, no. We're going to create some rules for them to make sure that they are good people that we're serving. So we want to make sure we're saving the good victims. And I say that obviously with a lot of sarcasm and criticism, but it is part of how our society functions and how we provide services for victims. So what this means for you. As a healer, this may mean that your patient is going to blame themselves. And that may cause you to question whether or not this experience is valid. Don't be fooled by that. When someone blames themselves, that does not invalidate their experience. The number one thing I see if I go on seeing with someone is they say, I can't believe this happened to me. I'm really sorry that you had to come out here. What resources do you have for my abuser? How can you help me make this person stop? Because he needs some help. If I hadn't done this, I came home and, I know that he doesn't like it when the kids are loud and the dogs are loud, so I always move them in the back of the house so that when he comes home, everything's quiet. And I couldn't get to it today. And, he was really upset later because, the kids were in the bath and my 2-year-old, he pooped in the bathtub. And that just really made him really upset because I wasn't able to deal with that. And so then he strangled me. And I'm not kidding, that's actually a narrative. And I'm not dismissing that victim either. There's been a lot of time where she's been trained to think of herself as the reason that she's being abused. Now, stigmatization may also be different based on cultural perspectives. So, for example, not just ethnic culture, but any culture, religious culture. Let's say that your religious culture forbids divorce. If you can't get divorced, and without losing friends and family, maybe you choose to stay. Natural supports will be less available, and stigmatization means that often those supports that are in place for a victim may be blaming or re-victimizing. And so oftentimes when people call to get help or resources, they're going to be blamed or re-victimized. Why did you stay? I don't understand why. I mean, I'll help you, but come on. So now, for you, starting the conversation. How do you start a conversation about domestic violence? Because a lot of you guys are going to be working in a field where you may be required to do domestic violence screenings, or you simply decide that you're going to do a domestic violence screening. Coming up to someone and saying, so, victim of DV is maybe not the best way to go about it, right? And so thinking about using normalizing language. A lot of families struggle with their relationships. So we're talking to everyone. That way your person you're talking to, they don't feel targeted. This isn't about you. This isn't about because I suspect you are a victim of domestic violence. It's because I'm talking to everybody about this. Universal education. We're talking to all of our patients about a healthy relationship. We want you all to know what a healthy relationship looks like because you deserve to be in one. And we're going to go through some issues on an unhealthy relationship too. Making sure that, of course, everything is confidential. And as healthcare practitioners, you already know that, I'm sure. But reminding one that all conversations are confidential. You're not going to share information with a partner. But two, where confidentiality ends. If your patient tells you they're going to kill themselves, or they're going to harm somebody else, or that their children are being harmed, you're under obligation to report. And you need to let them know that. Don't try to trick somebody and then you're like, gotcha, I'm going to report now, I got it. That's not the best way to go. So part of my job is working in prevention. I work with a lot of teens. And I always let teens know when I have to report. So for example, I say, listen, if you have a dating partner that's more than 2 years older than you, and you tell me that, I have to report. The moment I hear that, I have to report. So if you got a dating partner and you don't want to disclose their age, don't feel like you have to. And some people may say, well, that seems like, are allowing these teens to talk about their issues even though they may be in an illegal relationship. And that's exactly it. That's exactly what I'm doing. Interestingly, that does not prevent them from disclosing. They may disclose a little later, but if they're experiencing abuse, they disclose quite a bit. And the benefit of me having forewarned them about this, letting them know, is that when they decide to disclose and know that I'm going to make a report, they're making an informed decision. They're empowered in that decision. They also can make safety plans for themselves. If they're reporting to me against a family member or a partner, and they know that CPS is going to show up at the door or the police are going to show up at the door, they can make a safety plan for when that person does, so that I didn't get them in an aha moment and they didn't tell them and then CPS showed up and things did not go well. So screening, as I mentioned, you may be required to screen, you may be asked to screen. It is best practice to screen for domestic violence, but only if you do so well. An ineffective screen or a dangerous screen, if you can't screen well, don't screen. So if their partner's sitting right next to them and you're like, so, domestic violence relationship? Just skip that part on the questionnaire. You don't need to do that. Again, reconsider your language. Keep, that you want to, of course, also keep in mind that that when you're screening, oftentimes a person, when you first ask about domestic violence, they're not going to come forward and say, me. They have to trust you first. So your first time with them, they're probably not going to tell you about what's happening. You're probably going to get information about domestic violence after you've screened them. It's important not to blame them if they come to you later, but instead to think for yourself.
So how do you screen for the perpetrator?
And that is...
You're assuming there's males and there's females,
Mm-hmm.
which is not all the time.
No, you're right, and it's absolutely not all the time. But yeah, well, and there's a number of there's a number of.
Disclose, you're going through a history,
Mm-hmm.
Our things at home, etc.
Yeah.
And so, how would he or she then come out with, well, there is unrest and I'm involved in it?
A lot of times it can be in, and actually we'll come back, some of the red flags. But there's some small pieces of language that you can follow up on. So if you're talking to someone and they say, he keeps me pregnant. Well, that's an interesting statement. And for that, it may be domestic violence, it may not, but to ask to describe. So this is a really innocuous one. She handles the money. Now, if you were to ask in my marriage who handles the money, my husband would be like, oh yeah, she does. She handles the money. And he doesn't ask for an allowance. Mostly that just means that like I'm better organized to pay the bills on time. So I handle the money. But we also talk collectively about decisions. But if someone were to ask him, hey, what are the finances like? He'd be like, I don't know, she handles the money. And so but that also can be a red flag. You might say then, so tell me about this. Describe this more to me. And if you're talking to someone who's healthy, they're gonna be like, oh yeah, maybe I'm disorganized and that person pays the bills. Oh, well, she handles the money. She gives me an allowance and I have to make sure that I live within this allowance. And then what happens if you go over that allowance? Tell me what that looks like. A lot of times it's hearing these little red flags in a conversation that just seem a little bit off and following up. Making sure you're open to that possibility and following up with those questions. He doesn't know his own strength. She keeps me away from my friends or family. Those can be statements that don't mean much, and they can be statements that do. A lot of times domestic violence victims don't come out with it. They'll come out with a little something, and they're hoping that you're open enough to ask them another question about it. What they want is someone who's going to follow up with them, not someone who's going to leave them in the lurch. They've probably been left in the lurch. So they don't come out with it. They come out with little things, which is why over time, as you develop rapport with your patients, you're more likely to hear those narratives as you start asking questions about their health, their emotional health, what's going on with their family, and getting to know them as people.
What if you do identify a victim of domestic violence, male or female?
Mm-hmm.
As practitioners, what is our next step? I mean, we are obviously not equipped to then take them out of the abusive relationship.
No.
So what is our next step for them?
So let's see, because we can come back to that. We've already actually talked about all those things. We'll come back to that. To a positive screen. So remembering, one, that can happen at any time, whether you've scheduled to screen or not. First off, validate. Don't question, are you sure this is abuse? I'm really sorry for your experience. You deserve to feel safe. You deserve to be safe at home. And then letting people know what your boundaries are. As your healthcare practitioner, I can't save you from the situation. I can't place you somewhere else, but I can refer you to resources for people who can help. And letting them know there is another step. And I can help you take that step. You can't call and screen someone for us to check them into a shelter if they need shelter. But you can sit with them, and while they call, if they want that, you can say, do you need someone to sit with you? I've got some phone numbers. Do you need some help? Do you need someone to sit with you? Because I can do that.
There are many cases where the abuser tries to
Look like the victim?
yeah,
I've-
either they try to hurt themselves, they try to make the person,
Yes.
Oh, I see what you're saying. I thought you meant like physically. I was like, no. Yes. The person who is a perpetrator often may act as though they're the victim and may actually even believe that they are being victimized. It was interesting. We had a call where it was a dual arrest. He had shoved her and she threw his phone, and so in interviewing, talking to her, she was talking about like, oh, this is what happened, a really long story, and then we talked to him and he was like, I don't know what happened. She threw my phone. I was mad. I sat down, and boom, the cop showed up, and we're like, but you skipped the part where like you picked her up and threw her. And so that isn't often, as you might guess, included. And so I think as part of this question goes, if someone says that they're a victim of domestic violence, your first step is to believe them. Especially as a healthcare practitioner, no matter what, you say, okay, what can I do for you? And in doing something for them, you're not going to do something against their partner. You're this person's physician. You don't have to worry about that. But as far as, and this is something that we find, actually, El Mirage, I'm really excited about this, has introduced a new screening tool for domestic violence victims and fatalities, because we get a lot of times officers have a hard time figuring this out because the person who's been victimized is really upset and the person who victimized isn't. And so it's a series of just 4 questions that adds 9 minutes to a domestic violence call for the police. And that 4 questions has severely reduced in 1 year the number of domestic violence fatalities in their area, because it's allowed them to track who is actually abusive. And the questions are about power and control. They're 4 very simple questions about power and control where you can begin to map out a longer term of abuse than just the moment that they were called in. And usually that's how you can start to figure out abuse, is when you start talking about instances that are beyond this moment where you see 2 people who are upset or 1 person who's upset. And so, but again, as healthcare practitioners, someone comes in and talks to you, you say, I believe you, what can I do to help you? If they say, what I really need you to do to help me is to, make sure that my partner is institutionalized, that might be a really good sign for you that you're dealing with the abusive partner. But if what they might need is domestic violence resources, and if that's the case, you can resource them to an agency. You can talk to them about their mental health. You can make mental health referrals for them if they need them and say, so you're dealing with a lot of stress. How can I help you manage your stress? As someone who's caring for your health, I can resource you to domestic violence advocates. How can I help you care for the stress that you're feeling at the situation?
One of the things, for me being a mental health counselor on campus, I see a correlation between making referrals and the kinds of referrals that are the most successful are the ones that are done immediately.
Yes.
So you can, with that person in your office, say, poke your head out the door and say, I'm going to be a little late for my next appointment. Come back in and make the call.
Mm-hmm.
Don't hand that person off to another person to make the call, because then they feel like the hot potato. And
Exactly.
one of the things that a victim, in my experience, does not want to do is be a burden. Well, you're too busy, so I'm going to go to somebody else. Okay, what are they? And they come in and they go, well, what are we doing? What was it you needed? We're just really busy.
Yeah.
Yeah, I really just need it. Okay.
Tell me your story again.
I'll just make some calls.
Yeah. And honestly, the reason we do on-scene response is because when people hand a piece of paper to a victim in crisis,
I can't take
they can't take it home. they can't take it home with them. And they're gonna they don't feel supported, so they're not gonna make the call. You can't obviously call and say, okay, I've got this person and give all the information, but you can dial the number, sit with them, and hand the phone to them and support them while they make that call and let them know I'll do that for you. I will sit with you and I will make that call with you. If you can do that as a healthcare practitioner, your effectiveness in being able to help people in a domestic violence situation goes way up. So it doesn't mean that you have to roll out a cot in your office or in your home and be like, okay, you don't have a place to go, well, I got one for you. You don't want to do that, and that's for any wide variety of reasons you don't want to do that. But you can take the small step of sitting with them.
Honestly, talking about doing something for a person, my experience was that a person that we knew she had been abused, her jaw was broken, I was seeing her collaboratively with a dentist, and we knew that she had been punched in the face and her jaw had been broken. And but she wouldn't confide any additional information to the physician and I, or the dentist and I, see collaboratively, other than the fact that, yeah, she'd been hit, it was an accident, but there was a lot of other red flags around the situation. And I actually find, this is like probably 17 years after that encounter with that woman, and it still bothers me to this day that we somehow or another couldn't provide her with more than what we did, which was to tell her that it was a safe place, if she needed to give us more information, that we thought maybe more information might be helpful in caring for her. And it still bothers me to that day. So my experience is that it's not that someone's going to confide in me information that will lead me to being able to help them in some way, but that they won't because they're so afraid.
And that's something too. They may not. And this is something to remember too. The more people that a person who's experienced abuse meets, who says, I know that you said that this was an accident, but it very well could be, but I want you to know that sometimes these kinds of injuries mirror injuries that people experience when they're in a violent relationship. And so I just want you to know that you don't deserve to be treated, if you are being treated violently, you deserve respect. And I respect you here, we respect you here. And if you need support, ask us, we have resources for you. And that person may not take you up on it, but you may be one more person that has supported them. Maybe one more person has supported them, and in doing so, they may tell the next person.
Is there any data on socioeconomic groups that are more prone to domestic violence, any particular clusters?
Mm-hmm. And it's not that there's no data, that there's no difference. There's no socioeconomic group that experiences violence more predominantly than another. People who are less secure financially or poor are less capable of hiding it. They don't have a lot of the same resources to hide their experience as people in higher socioeconomic groups do. But violence experience is pretty well across the spectrum.
Because I've read some reports post-recession, there's a cycle of more cases of domestic violence linked to the economy and all that.
Now, economic stress does increase the likelihood that violence may occur. But what happens in that situation too is you may already have a situation that's a very unhealthy situation, and then it escalates. So it didn't start off in a place where people were just happy as they could be, and then they became violent. You've got a situation where a lot of the power and control factors are less obvious, and as this person is experiencing, the perpetrator is experiencing more stress, their ability to stay here diminishes and they escalate. And so what we see then is an increase in the number of folks who were already experiencing some forms of violence and now are experiencing more exaggerated forms of violence. is this safe for you to take home? Even if they said they've never been in a domestic violence relationship, to say, hey, I've got these materials, do you want these materials? Just so that they understand, I'm giving this to you. Is this something you're going to be okay with carrying with you? Because that may not be safe. There's a lot of folks I talk to where I'm like, I've got this pamphlet. They're like, nope, not my house. Or they're like, yes, I'm going to go hide it right now. And then they go find an elaborate hiding place to put this pamphlet in. And so, hiding materials is something that sometimes people do when they think, they're not listening to me, but I know that they need this help. I'm going to just stick this in the person. I'm going to see, don't do that. It's bad. Lots of organizations give out what are called shoe cards. Shoe cards are the size of a shoe. Fit like a little card that you stick inside your shoe and you can wear it on your foot. If a person is comfortable with a shoe card, you can give them that too. And say, if this is something you want to hide, it's a little card you can put in your shoe. And they may say yes, they may still say no. And also, someone that want to if they don't want to leave their relationship, don't blame them for it. How can I support you in the situation? How can I help you safety plan? In that safety planning, can I call you at the house? Can I call you at this number? Is it safe? Should we have a code word that lets me know that you are not, that the conversation is being listened in on? So for example, if you say, I'm so sorry, the reception is really bad, the reception is your code word, then you go, oh, the other person's on the other line, I'm not going to disclose any more private information with this person on the phone at the time. And then finally, referrals. This is my organization here. We are located in Apache Junction and we serve all of Northern Canal and Eastern Maricopa County. Our services include shelter, but also legal advocacy, which means that we can do court accompaniments. We can help people sort through court paperwork for orders of protection, divorce, child custody hearings. Additionally, we have food boxes, clothing and housing resources. We have counseling and support work. All of our resources are free. Every other organization in the area is going to have the same or similar resources, and they're all going to be free. And domestic violence as a victim should not ever have an economic barrier to paying for the resources. And so, if our organization is the place that would serve your area, give us a call and say, I need some pamphlets, I need some stuff from you, so that I know how to resource. If it's not, check out the Arizona Coalition Against Domestic and Sexual Violence. And what they'll do is, you'll tell them where you are, and they'll tell you who's there. These are the people who are going to service you in your area, and they'll connect you. Be proactive in taking those steps, because one of the worst things that happens is I think people decide not to screen because they don't know what to do if they got a positive screen. If you have the information, you get a little less nervous.